Hello, I'm Susan Cooper. I'm an artist. I've done a lot of public art over the last 30 years, and in each piece I studied the background and the history of the site as well as the facility. After doing a lot of that, I decided it was time to study my family history and commission myself to create it. So because I'm the namesake of my aunt, I created Storyline to honor my aunt who was murdered along with her family in 1943. So this follows the family from that period on to America with lives well lived. And I want to thank everybody involved in helping this, and I really hope you enjoy this tour. Thank you. The wooden synagogues existed in Russia, Poland, the Ukraine for hundreds of years, and they were each unique. They've been built by local people. Sometimes people that weren't Jewish were hired to do them because Jews weren't always allowed to be part of guilds. They were wood and beautifully crafted. On the outside you can't tell, but the insides were incredibly elaborate. Bimas were gorgeous, and because it was generations, people were able to work on them for all these years. So sons could learn from their fathers, and there was painting, never of people, but of floral, botany kind of images, and sometimes even astrological images. They were all documented in the beginning of the 20th century by a photographer, a man who did such a wonderful job that later this Polish family, a Polish couple, documented them in a book called Lost Synagogues of Europe. They were all destroyed in 1939, all the ones that I have here. Ones that were not destroyed were eventually used as stables or gymnasiums, and they fell apart. Therefore, we really don't know what they looked like. My family came here by the SS Carroll. The SS Carroll was the ship that brought them to the U.S. My mother was born in a house in Bingen, which is spelled Bedzin, and that was a house that my grandparents built in 1906, which coincidentally is the year in which my house that I currently live in was built. It was a factory, well, it was a tailor factory. My grandfather and the sons did and also some workers were tailors, and then their merchandise was sold in the front, the lower level of the front of the building, and the family lived upstairs. It was a large family, so they all lived there. And now, I visited that building in 2018 and was shocked to see it still looking great. The difference being that it had been broken up into smaller apartments, but it still was located across from the City Hall and with a park between it and the City Hall. There's also an image of the synagogue that they had used. The synagogue was masonry and had been used for quite a long time, maybe 100 years, not more than that. It had been destroyed. It had been burned down with 60 people inside in 1939. But the family did get here and made a life for themselves. They came here because my oldest uncles had been conscripted into the Polish army, which was treacherous for Jews at that time. They were forced to stay in the army for 20 to 25 years, and they were mistreated because they were Jewish. So my grandmother buried their bicycles, burned their uniforms, and sent them on to Germany, which was safe at that time. That was not easy for them to do. But then, because they had to sneak them, they had to bribe their way into Germany, and then as they crossed the border, because they were defectors of the Polish army, Polish soldiers shot at them. But they weren't hit, and they got to Hanover where there was family, and they eventually got to America. My grandparents took the younger children and moved to Fort Worth, Texas, where my grandmother's sister lived. And my grandmother's sister and her husband moved to Fort Worth where her husband had family. The reason they had gone to Fort Worth, Texas, is because while playing in a field in Poland, their 12-year-old daughter was murdered by a Russian soldier. This was right at the beginning of World War I. So my grandparents got to Fort Worth. They had a little confectionery and sundries and fruit, and made enough money that they could sell everything. And in my grandmother's new car, which was a Model A that only she drove, they got to Los Angeles, where she was able to buy some properties that the family could live in eventually. The family in LA did well. My grandfather continued to be a tailor. He was a tailor working for his sons, which were better tailors at that point in Los Angeles. And my grandfather came home one day and told his mother that he had been working with a man who was a shagus, but he was so nice, shagus meaning non-Jew, and his name was Cary Grant, and the real one. And then, so that was a nice story. Funny, nice things started happening to them. I was born in a house in Beverlywood of LA, which was a nice neighborhood that my parents moved to. That house no longer exists. And my father was a pharmacist. He had a wonderful car that I loved as a child. It's a Buick, and it's in this mural. And he had a pharmacy on Lasky Drive in Beverly Hills, which is now a plastic surgery clinic. Then I went on to Berkeley, and that was the beginning of my individual life. I learned so much, and it really broadened my horizons to be at Berkeley. My other grandmother, when she died at the age of, she was only 85, whereas my grandfather died at 89. The other two grandparents, the Lefkowitz family, they lived till 93 and 95, and they died 4 days apart of separate causes. They were still living in their own house and had a garden. Anyway, when Grandma Cooper died, she left me $750. And I was 23. I had graduated. I had a master's degree. So I bought my first car, which was the VW bus. And with it, I drove to Roswell, New Mexico, where I had a painting grant. There was a wonderful community of artists because the founder, an oil man who used his money to support artists that weren't known but needed the time to really concentrate on their career and even find out whether or not they wanted to stay in that career. He once told me that some of the artists never did art again, and that was okay because they learned not to, but that was very rare. Most of the artists went on to do good things. Some of them were quite well known. One was Robert Colescott, one was Allison Sars, and then there was me. I was more determined than ever to stay in that career. And I went on to Santa Fe and lived there for a year before moving to Denver. There's also some images here of where my parents moved in their later years to Palm Springs, and also you can see the pharmacy. It's a big building. His pharmacy wasn't as big as the building, but it now is a liquor store. So I went on that VW bus. The transmission was awful. So although my father had cut me off for becoming an artist, he reinstated me when he saw I was doing well and bought me the Datsun pickup, which was good, and my dog Elliot and my dog Apple fit in there nicely. And then I moved to Denver. The first house that I owned with my husband was in Hilltop, and there I became pregnant, and what you did in those days, if you could afford it and you were pregnant, you bought a Volvo station wagon, which you can see here. And you can see the place I lived that was in France on an artist in residency. And you could see an abstraction of my daughter's house, which is in Hilltop. And the Kirkland Museum, where a few of my pieces reside. And you can see the home that I live in now, and the studio where I work. So in that home, I began working on projects to bring back my aunt, after whom I'm named, Gittel Reisel Lefkowitz, and then she became Gittel Reisel Fischel when she got married. And because I was named for her, which was an honor and great significance to me, and also a responsibility. Every few decades, I really get into that. In my art career, I began doing public art. A significant public art project is in the rotunda of the Capitol, the city and county building Capitol in Denver. And these are two murals that face each other in the rotunda. One is the Denver at the beginning of the century, the 20th century, and the other as the end of the millennia, the 2000 millennium. So they're each 14 feet by 7 feet. They come out 8 inches. And very often, dignitaries are photographed in front of them because they're very colorful. And here's an interesting story. This project went to Poland in 2019. It was there for a month. It went to the city of Chmielnik, and I had the show there. It was advised by the Poland Museum Polin Museum in Warsaw, because this particular museum had been a synagogue and all the Jews there were, of course, murdered, but the that community, Chmielnik, was so into their Jewish history that they built a bima, a full-size bima, out of cast glass. It's quite astonishing to see it there, and a little odd because a lot of people who are Catholic get married in the replica of the bima. So, but that's all right. Anyway, we came back from that trip and we were exhausted and we didn't know what to do with ourselves, so we turned on the TV, and it was a national broadcast of Yamiche Alcindor in front of the city and county building mural because she was there doing a report on marijuana in Denver. So I really enjoyed that, but I was so jet lagged. I just said to my husband, Rick, "Oh, look who's in front of my murals." And he said, "Wait a minute, that's NPR. It's going around the country." Or around the world, for all that matter. Anyway, I have this ability to do public art and do that always, even if it's abstract, it relates to the history of the site. So therefore, I decided this had to be done. It had to be finished really, really well. And besides that, it was around that time that the protest in Charlottesville happened. And even though I had already begun this project, I was determined to put everything into it. So this honors Gittel Reisel. It makes me feel I have finished a tribute to her and to all Jews, whether there's a story about their experience in Europe or not. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for watching it, and I wish to thank Jeannie Abrams, professor and curator of the Beck Archive at the University of Denver, and Madison Sussman, who helped enormously with this exhibition, and Susan Burson, who has encouraged it all along. Thank you so much.